Liberate, the podcast where we explore what it means to live a life of deep liberation and unbridled pleasure in love, life, and business. My name's Lauren Becker. Nothing is off limits here. Get ready to come alive in full-bodied, wildly enriching, soul-aligned possibility. This is your permission to liberate.
It's time to be someone I want to recognize. The future starts right now. I made a reservation, but you never came, so I'm checking out. The fire you stole away. I know one day we'll come back around. The future is now.
Thank you so much for joining me today. I've got Miroslav Petrovic joining me today, and Miroslav is a TedX speaker, teacher, and facilitator who has worked with over 5,000 people across the world, supporting them to bring their message to the world through the Enlivened Speaking Institute. So this institute that Miroslav has is an institute that I recently completed, and I would love to share more on that as well. It completely changed my life, and there's so many things that I have loved about you and the way in which you show up and embody yourself to then permeate that out into the rest of the world. But one of the things that I really love about what you do and how you do it, Miroslav, is this ability to surrender yourself over to what's unfolding, what's being revealed, what's coming through you. And I feel like that's a lot of what your work does. And it's funny because I remember coming into the Enlivened Speaking Institute being like, great, awesome, I want to be a speaker, I want to stand on stages, this is what I want to do. And it was so much more than that, so much more than that. And one of the things that I see in your bio is that you really love to teach people how to go beyond the didactic, talking at people, and how to deliver your message in an embodied way that is enlivening and engaging for audiences. I find whenever I speak to you, Miroslav, gathering words to the energetics that arise in my body when I speak to you, and when I hear you speak, when I watch you speak, I feel like you've truly mastered and cultivated this capacity to permeate into the subtle layers and subtle levels of human existence to bring it forward and up to the surface. And sometimes my brain doesn't always have words for that. So thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. I really appreciate you being here.
Thank you for having me, Laura.
I would love to know, first and foremost, what is liberation and enlivenment to you? Why the Enlivened Speaking Institute? What does that mean?
Yeah, cool. Nice questions. I think enlivenment to me is actually being in relationship with life and not. I think for most of us, the default place we live, unless we've put time and energy into it, is like an objectification of the world. So the world is a bit two-dimensional and we live in it, and there's not much felt sense. It's like, this is a phone, this is a table, I'm a person, and it's a bit like a cardboard world, and for me, enlivenment is this process of how do we come into deeper relationship with life itself, and how do we be more actively feeling life moving through us. I mean, I don't know, maybe this is where we're going, but it's like we banter on about this thing of how life is short so often, but I feel like the last 30 years have gone by like this. And I feel enlivenment probably brings us closer to death as well, like death as an experience. We're not going to be here forever. What is it that we want to do with life? But it's also like not just our goals. I also feel there's a relationship of what life wants to do with us. And I'm probably even more interested in that question. Like there's definitely a steering and a balancing and a journey to be had. But you know, Wayne Dyer's words come to mind, and he was kind of paraphrasing the Tao, but it's like from conception through to birth, life takes care of everything. Like life knows exactly what chemicals need to go where, and it just makes this miracle baby come out. And even for the first few years, it's like life is just doing everything, you know. And then at some point it's like this sense of objectification or identity comes in, and it's like, thanks life, I've got it from here, you know, you can take a back seat. So enlivenment is a bit like coming back into that relationship that created all of this. I think that's a bit more of an esoteric description. I'd say in a practical way, it's just about how do we feel more on stage with each other as we're going about our life.
Why do you feel that's so important for everyone? Why is that important for you as well? Yeah,
well, for me, because I'd probably been numb for so long without even knowing I was numb. I remember at one point I went overseas and I came back and I was talking to my brother, and I moved for a lot of stuff while I was traveling. And I remember saying to my brother, I'm pretty sure I was depressed. Like, I'm sure if I went to a doctor, they would have told me, you're depressed, Miroslav. It's like, Miroslav, you didn't need a doctor. I could have told you were depressed. But that was probably, I'd say, maybe 3 years of my life in a pretty heavy depressive state. And I had no awareness of it. And I feel that's probably a lot of what happens out there. It's like we take what we know to be as normal, even if our capacity, like, it's not even a capacity. It's like, even if our relationship with life is numb, we don't know we're numb because that's all we've ever felt. And maybe enlivenment is like re-sensitizing to life. And why it's important, it's like it is fucking living, you know. What's the point of having the house and the car and the pretty family if you're not actually enjoying it? And if you are enjoying it, it's like you find you don't need as much. It's because you're actually enjoying what you do have. Recently, someone asked me what are your business goals or something moving forward, and I was like, my main goal is actually just to appreciate more of what I have. Like if things continue as they are, and I can just be in deeper appreciation of it, I'm like, we're on a good roll, you know. What about you?
What about me in terms of why
what
is it
does
important?
enlivenment mean to you?
What does enlivenment mean to you? Enlivenment means to me moving through life, all that you said, and the picture that I see is that, you know, we have, well, it's estimated we've got about 30 trillion cells in our body. And I just see these 30 trillion cells like vibrating with absolute aliveness, vibrating separately, but also vibrating in relationship to each other, and they're bouncing off and they're having so much joy and so much fun with each other. So on a visual level, that's what I see in my body. And that's because life is just pouring through me and drenching me, and like I'm marinating in life. I'm marinating in the purest, most quality, dense, concentrated energy of life. And that's how I move through the world in that. And that for me is like enlivenment, aliveness. And it's thrilling, and it's, you know, all the range of feelings essentially. Yeah, how can we feel more of life? Because I agree, like I feel like there's been, and I have a similar story to you. I've got my own version of what you mentioned in terms of, you know, the mental health or the depression or the shutdown, the numbness. And it's almost like a re-inhabitation. I don't even know if that's a word, but re-inhabiting our body fully and entirely, for us to really appreciate and be in the joy and the richness of what we're actually doing. Because otherwise, what's the point in doing it? What's the point in actually being in the human body? Yeah. How does that connect into, because I know there's a part of me that wants to really jump here. I'm like, oh, do we go there? There was something that you and I have spoken about when it comes to speaking, and I remember saying to you one time, like, when I've stood on stages, I feel like I've almost like touched God. Like, I feel like I've touched into this slipstream of dissolution, and it's felt like I've kind of touched God. I would love to dive straight into what you, because I know that you speak into God as well as the divine and whatnot. What does your version of God mean, and also how does that show up in your world? What does it mean for you in your world?
Yeah, it's a nice question. I mean, it's going to sound very similar. It's a relationship to life itself. So it's like an unfiltered, first-hand relationship. So if I was to kind of metaphor it, instead of you telling me what it's like to travel to Japan, it's like I've actually got the experience of being in Japan. And I think for a lot of us, unconsciously, we relate to God as a concept from a book or, I don't know, a figure of some kind telling us what it is. And for me, it's more about how can I more deeply be feeling that relationship to life as a moment-to-moment experience. And I mean, the G word is a funny one because it's so loaded for people. And it takes almost deconditioning to come back to its essence. And even when I say these words, I'm like, I really don't know what kind of sense people make of them, you know? I'll give you my first experience of this. So I used to argue that God doesn't exist, and I'd still argue that the conceptual version of God doesn't exist. But I was at this like workshop festival thing many years ago, probably would have been like 2021, and every morning I was doing the same practice with this one teacher, which was quite a rigorous breathing practice, not breath work, but a very specific practice that was passed down to him from one of his teachers in India. And that Indian teacher was like, you have to teach this now. Like, I've given it to you. You can't just kind of hoard this. You got to take it out to the world. And I was doing this practice, and after about 3 or 4 days, my mind's just switched off. Now, I don't mean switched off like I went stupid. I mean like there was no noise in there, and all that was left was this like really, really deep relationship with life. And at times, like I remember at lunch sitting there, and people were talking about, and I didn't even care what they were speaking about. Like I was just in awe of the fact, you know, there was humans and they were speaking, and like the magic of life was just there in its full brilliance without me objectifying it as this guy's talking about shit I don't care about. And when I dropped into that experience that first time, I was like, oh, this is fucking God. And this is that thing people have been trying to label from so many different angles for so long. But the experience is not like any of the words. The words are just like pointers to something that can be experienced that's beyond objectified living.
It's definitely a big topic, isn't it? And I'm having so many of these, like there's just so much that layers this, and I completely agree with you in terms of the the concept that we've been sold around it. What does it feel like in your body?
The first word that came up was I feel insignificant. And the feeling is like floating for me. like I lean back, and instead of being like a body trying to swim in the water, it's like the water's holding me, yet I'm in relationship to the water as well. It's like my body expands through a process of surrendering.
Beautiful.
It's really nice. And also, you know, like I think the perpetual journey is, for me, is how do we live more continually in relationship to, you can call it God, but you know, whatever you want to call that thing, whatever you want to call the fullness of who we really are beyond just the mind. And like touching these experiences is almost like getting a sample or getting a bite of it, to be like, oh wow, there's a reference point for this now and it exists. But then it's like, how can I live more intimately with this part of myself, regardless of what else is happening?
And I'd love to, because I'm just getting this, like this touching into, you know, all these different parts of our life that we've essentially maybe feared or had these concepts that we've been taught that this is how it is, but it almost shuts down our ability to fully open to something because we have this one idea of it. And I'm curious to know, like, what your journey was with even diving into speaking, or even diving into, you know, coming to this point. Like, what's the question that I'm trying to ask? How did you get from that man who was shut down, numb, depressed, to where you are now?
So, I'm like, do I give you a couple of key moments? Do I give you a few snippets? That could be quite a long story, which I don't want to go into the long story. Essentially, for me, if I was to just give you the bullet points of my journey, things started changing. So I used to be not just depressed. I used to stutter. I used to be almost mute. If people didn't know me, I wasn't mute around my friends and family, but around strangers, I was just like, not available to speak. And the first shift started when I began meditating. I was like, oh wow, it's possible to have a whole different relationship in life. And I was like, why the fuck did no one tell me about this? You know, I was probably like 18 or something when I first meditated, maybe even 19, 20. I can't remember. It's somewhere in the archives. And I was just like, this is fucking crazy. I've gone through, I don't know, 15 years of education. Another single one of my teachers was like, hey, come check this out. You know, this is actually going to help you with everything else in life. I kind of felt a bit ripped off that it took 18 years to get to that point. And when I started having that experience of a more expansive state inside myself, I started asking the question, how can I experience this, but with my eyes open? Because it's a bit, you know, you're kind of shut off from the world when you're not shut off from the world, but you're shut off from people when you're meditating. And that way that really quickly showed up was in teaching, speaking, and facilitating. And that was like really fucking scary because I didn't want to speak in front of people. But the moment I started opening that doorway and teaching other people to meditate, and then all kinds of other things over the years up until speaking, which I'm doing now, it was a process of all this stuff that was hidden inside me coming to the light of day. Like from being that suppressed to like, oh wow, to engage with these people, there's a certain flavor that wants to move through me, which is kind of scary because I've never let people see me, I don't know, be vulnerable or be angry or something. But in this moment, it's like to touch these people, this is where the energy and the intention wants to go. And I'm surrendering to allow that to move through me, which tends to be enlivening both for me, but also for people watching, because we're seeing something come to life for the first time.
And I'm curious to know what that really subtle moment was from, you acknowledging that, oh, this is how I do it. I do it through speaking, teaching, from where you were to that, okay, now I'm choosing this thing. Because I don't know about you, but like for me, even before choosing to get into the course, I know we've had this conversation before, but before choosing to go into the course, it's a whole process in itself of, I'm feeling something in my body, there's something that's moving, there's, you know, there's a whole process that happens in that tiny micro, but actually macro moment of, okay, this is where I am, and oh, this is maybe the thing that I need to do, and then now I'm actually going and doing it. What does that look like or feel like for you in terms of your process? How did that, like, because I feel like I don't normally just go, great, this is what I feel like doing, I'm gonna go out and do it. It's a whole bag of, you know, my body brings up a lot of stuff essentially. So what did you have to move through, and what was your process, and what did that look like for you? Because I feel like this would be really beneficial when we're doing anything in life. I feel like this is almost like the process. This is the little pathway that we have to take, even just to say yes.
Yeah, the first, or one of the first times, but definitely the first time I can almost label it and say this is probably the first time this happened. One of the first workshops I ever did, at the end of the workshop, we were all sitting in a circle and we just had to share whatever the prompt was. I can't remember, but I remember the first time, it's like I had a split between the intensity of fear that was in my body, and you could call it the witnessing presence. And instead of like speaking to get away from the feeling and to be like, oh, it's finally done, you know, in that instance, I remember it came to my turn to speak and I wasn't enjoying the fear in my body so much. I was like, no, I want to go last. Like, I just want to be in the experience. And it's like, I want to digest this and not to get to the end of it. Like, I'm enjoying the experience of having fear run through my body and not needing to do anything with it. And I remember that moment distinctly, because a lot of what you're asking, I feel there's a relationship between fear. I'm going to use the word fear, but just relabel it very soon after this, because the English language is a bit tight here. Where fear shows up, we have no fucking control over. And there's something in our relationship with life where fear is almost the invitation or the calling. Where it's like, that's where, if you want, God or life knocks and it's like, hey, listen to me, maybe you want to do this. And usually we don't, we kind of steer the other way. We're like, no, fuck that shit, I'm going to be safe. But when we do open to the feel, like, that's where magic and enlivenment happens. And what I love about it is it's so fucking illogical. Like, even to take it off the stage, there's a story I've shared before around just being in a shopping center and seeing this beautiful young woman and just needing to tell her how, I don't know, how beautiful I found her, how attractive she was. And this was like in a setting where I don't want to go into the full story now, but it was public. She was working and selling pizza. I told her this over the counter. Everyone kind of stopped. It was one of those moments where, like, that was weird. And I didn't want anything. Like, I had a partner at the time, didn't want to ask her on a date, just kind of offered these words. I was shaking when I said the words to her. It was really scary. And I walked away holding my pizza and my body just went into complete bliss. And I'm like, here I am standing in like Melbourne's fashion capital shopping center, having this like fucking divine experience. And I had to stop because my legs were shaking so much. I was like, it was just an overload of bliss running through my body. And I shared this story at a retreat I was running some months later. And this woman was going to me, but it doesn't make sense. I'm like, I know. And the woman I was speaking to was really beautiful as well. And I was like, I can tell you you're beautiful now and I don't feel anything. And I can mean those words, like I do mean them, but there's no activation in my body. There's like no charge going, you really need to do this. It's like, it just feels safe and easy. And I feel there's magic when that invitation shows up and we choose to lean into the magic, essentially, because we often don't know what's on the other side of that. Does that help at all in answering your question? I'm like, that's somewhere.
Absolutely. And essentially those moments of you leaning into that have led you to where you are right now,
Yeah.
to this. And this is one of the things that I presenced at the beginning of what I enjoy witnessing about you is that process of you leaning into that is what I experience as this surrender to what's revealing itself. And you mentioned at the beginning, what does life want to do with us? And I feel that so perfectly demonstrates that. What does life want to do with us? Because we don't know what's going to be birthed on the other side of that at all. And I feel like that's the thrill as well. Like there's something thrilling in that.
I mean, it's like that is adventure, you know? Like it's not just that we don't even know who we're gonna be on the other side of that, because usually I find those moments that call us into the adventure, they're usually actions we haven't done before. Or things we haven't said before, whatever the version of it is. But yeah, you were gonna go on.
Yeah, I would love to know how this connects into sexuality and intimacy.
My experience of like journeying with my sexuality, it was more or less, I don't want to say the same, but it kind of is the same. It was like, I don't know, if I had a pattern of making love in a certain way, which for me, I'd say early on was a lot more softer, and I could even go so far as to say recluse. Coming into expressing more of my dominance in lovemaking was like really fucking vulnerable. And like, okay, but here's that same feeling, like here's that same fear feeling of this part wants to express, and can I let myself journey with that? With sexuality, obviously, if you're doing it with other people, there has to be full consent with what you're journeying. And not just consent, but you have to feel safe. I don't feel a lot of this stuff can open up without the safety. And intimacy in a similar way. And I find it's like the way some of those invitations have shown up through sex and intimacy have what's allowed me to redefine that relationship with it. I don't know. Does that kind of answering?
Yeah, and I feel like this permeates into every single area of our life. And so you showing up in that more dominant way in sexuality, how did that then permeate into your purpose and your soul expression in the world?
Yeah, well, as you said, there's no difference, you know. And for me, like, firstly, I'll say this: sex and speaking are probably two of our most you can call them our closest relationships to God. You can call them like an absolute mirror of probably how we do the rest of our life. Like if you put someone on stage and they have to be completely rehearsed and remember every single line to feel safe, that's going to tell you a fair bit about who they are in their life. And based on how someone is in the bedroom, you're probably going to have an idea of other elements of their life. So when you start tweaking either one of those, you start seeing like pretty big ripples in people's lives. One thing that definitely as like that intensity for me of like expressing anger, but not in being angry, like almost in making a stand for something, I'd probably say that first showed up on the stage, even when it wasn't showing up in my life. But when it showed up on the stage, I was like, oh wow, this is a reference point for it. But having the opportunity to express it on stage was not as common for me as how many times I could express it in the bedroom. It was just like, you know, I was having sex a lot more than I was being on stage, obviously. So it just gave me a regular capacity to develop a relationship with that piece. And like who we show up in the bedroom, usually these parts we can't bring into the rest of society too, if that makes sense. It's like the stage of the bedroom or having sex allows for so much more expression than we're allowed in everyday life.
Mhm.
And I think essentially, as I started tapping that and playing with more of my range sexually, it's like my life started getting easier. I let myself
Mm.
play more, let myself have more humor, and not take myself as seriously. I definitely feel like it's melted away some layers that I was holding there unconsciously, and it continues to as well. I think that's the magic of all of these practices. If they start getting boring, it just means we're not leaning into life.
Mm. Yeah, I love that. I love that you presence that. Do you have, so to really like give some people some tangible things, like the leaning into the fear rather than wanting to pull away, the opening, and it's not like leaning in it as in like I'm going to shut down my whole body and not feel this. From what you've said, it's this, oh, actually I'm going to open up and see how much of this I can feel in this moment and lean into this pool that is running through my body, this pool of emotion, this pool of feeling that's in my body, and touch that. Let that touch me. Do you have a daily like ritual or something specific that you do that helps you, that helps move you forward, that helps keep you, I guess, in this place, that helps support you? And do you have any recommendations for people that they can also start to implement?
I just remember the time I was hanging out with this like very intense yoga teacher, and we were just having a chat, and his morning ritual at the time was like 3.5 hours. And it was everything from like breath work to asana to like pulling water into his anus and bringing it back out. Like he had like pretty supreme control over his body. And he goes to me, "How about you? What's your morning practice?" And I was like, "I just like to be as vulnerable and close to life as I can, as a moment to moment experience." Sometimes I have a regular morning practice, and that can go on for months. And other times I don't. Like now my morning practice is irregular. I meditate, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 days out of the week. And sometimes maybe like 2 days out of the week. But I'd say what my practice is as an ongoing relationship, it's like leaning into and meeting the fear when it calls me to. Like that's become a bit like a muscle that I just won't say no to that part of myself anymore. And I'm also like of the awareness that that part can only exist because of the fact that I had a regular practice for so long. Like to be able to separate fear and to act on it as opposed to being influenced by it, you need some kind of practice where you have somatic awareness. Whether you get that through dance or meditation or sexuality, doesn't really matter. But you need to have a baseline practice to begin to separate those two. Because if they're meshed in together, you won't even see it. Your mind's just going to respond to the fear as if it's a real fear, as opposed to what I call metafear.
Can you explain a little bit about Metafear? Because you've actually done a TED talk on this, which I'm gonna link in the notes as well, if that's okay with you. Yeah.
So in brief, I would say that fear could be translated as like a future event we'd prefer to avoid, whether it's logical or not. Like getting on stage for a lot of people brings up a lot of fear when in fact there's a good chance nothing bad's going to happen. Metafear is essentially what we've been talking about. It's this idea of meeting fear and going through the gateway, but you recognize that the purpose of doing it is more like meeting God. And there's some nice, I'm quoting this guy's book a lot. Rabbi Alan Liu talks about this distinction in Hebrew between how in Hebrew you have 2 different words that are translated as fear in English. One of them is pahad, which is basically what I said before, something you prefer to avoid. And they have a different word called yira, and yira is more closer to the English word awe. And it's this sense of being overrun by the amount of energy or information running through your body. it's like we don't know what to do with it, so we panic. And this is the words they would use when in reference to like meeting God or the angels. I'm not a big Bible person, so like some of you might know more on this topic. But essentially, when I read these words, I was like, oh, Jesus, this is what I've been doing for years. And I didn't even have a reference point for it. My own experience to it was, it takes me hours to bring my mind to this kind of stillness and meditation. But when fear hits me, and what I'm calling metafear here, so it's like, it's if someone's running after you for baseball bat, that's not metafear, that's fear. Like, you know, get the fuck out of there.
Yeah.
If it's like you want to say to your father that you love him and you're really scared, that's metafear. Like that's like a part of you wants to be expressed, and you've never said these words before, and you don't know who you're going to be on the other side. And sometimes it can be verbal, sometimes it can be action. It doesn't really matter. It's just however that invitation shows up. And that is an experience of being opened by life or by God into a part of ourselves we don't really know. And we're like on, it's like being on the wave of life. So it's like you can plan for how you're going to jump on the surfboard, but when the wave hits, it's like you have to be in relationship to it. And both you're moving and life's moving, and you're kind of navigating, where are we going together in this moment? And there's something really beautiful about it, because it's just unknown. You know, when those moments happen, it's like, it is fucking scary. And it's also worth living for. Like for me, if I'm going to go on stage and that feeling doesn't show up, I was like, oh, there's just nothing on the line. Like, yeah, I can give these people some stuff I know, which might be interesting. But unless we touch God in the experience, a part of me feels like, what's the point, or what's the purpose?
There's such a potency in the energetics that arise as you speak those words, and it feels like I'm in this bliss of that's saturating my body. With such resonance, such resonance.
Reminds me of our first conversation when you were signing up to the Institute.
What's that?
So just for context, Lauren and I had a conversation. She was like, all right, let me think about it. And then we went to have a second conversation. She was like, Miroslav, I've decided it's kind of not for me, or not right now, something like that. I was like, why not? What's going on for you? And when we dropped into it, it was like this just wave of what you could call metafear, just like emanated through the room. And I don't know how long that was there. It was timeless. But I remember just sitting there being like, I could just sit in this forever. It's like on one hand, you could call it fear. On another hand, you could call it bliss.
I think that's a really poignant way to capture the essence of, I want to say, the pathway of our life. Are we choosing the bliss, or are we choosing the fear? Because they're one and the same. It feels really beautiful.
It does.
Is there anything else that you would like to share?
I guess it's a curiosity, or just an offering. Like last night I was doing I was on a stand-up stage for the first time in my life. So I'm very comfortable on most other stages I've done, but the stand-up is different because for me it was a bit like I feel like I need to be a monkey and perform. It's like I need to make people laugh. Like I need to perform. I can't be. It's like you can get away with being interesting, but it's like the barometer is really, are people laughing or not? And I remember standing behind the curtain before I was about to go out, and I'm like, oh, my legs are shaking, and it feels nice to be this activated, And to say this from a genuine place, it's like the fear may never go away, but our relationship with it changes so fundamentally. It's like I was standing there and my legs were shaking and it wasn't even a problem. I was like, this is a beautiful experience. And it was magic when I went on stage, and just feeling like we need to get rid or feel perfect or numb ourselves of life to be able to do something is just, I feel we've been going about it the wrong way. And I feel if you want collectively what life is calling from us now is to be more in relationship with her.
Amen. Oh, thank you so much for joining. What a pleasurable, delicious conversation. And if you want to follow Miroslav, I will pop the show notes, his contact details in the show notes, and you can jump over and connect in with him. He's got some incredible things. Highly recommend his Enlivened Speaking Institute. Highly recommend it. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me, Lauren.
Thank you for joining me on the Liberate podcast. Remember, deep unbridled pleasure, love, and freedom is your absolute birthright. If you've loved this episode, head to Apple Podcast or iTunes, subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. Join me next time for another wildly liberating and deeply enriching conversation. See you then.